From Toylab Media LLC, this is your place for comic, TV, and film news, the Toylabpodcast. One enthralling story in just 10 minutes. Alright, let's have some fun. Here we go.
This is Maddie B., one of the founding bloggers of Toylab, and your host on today's show. I am really excited to be here and have you all with me. And I have a guest today, so I'm excited about that as well. I'm here with Katey Komics. She's a local cosplay photographer and upstart blogger. It's kind of embarrassing because there's probably like 15 years age difference between us. And I used to think I was young, but now I'm with Katey Komics, and I'm like, oh, I'm like an old man here.
Yo, yo, yo.
And yeah, you say stuff like that, and I can't say stuff like that anymore. I'm too old. We have our podcast studio up and running. It's pretty humble setup. It's still off my kitchen table, but Katey Komics is she's game for that. So she's agreed to do this show and a couple others. So big thank you for her. Big thank you to the band Alon Vital to letting us use some of their music in our intro. And it's been a little bit of a journey, but we finally are up and running, and I'm excited to be here. We're going to try to make this show be about 10 minutes long. Our theme is going to be Blade, which probably immediately is striking many people. Why are you going to talk about Blade? Because nobody is talking about Blade. Nobody has talked about Blade in quite a while. His last movie, Blade 3, was not particularly well received. But obviously Blade 1 and Blade 2 were, but that was a while ago. So why talk about Blade? Well, I have my reasons. And I think the primary reason is that beneath the surface, there's actually a lot of things going on with Blade right now. There's lots of murmurings. There's actually a lot of other bloggers who are poking around some of the same things that I'm poking around with. Mm-hmm. We're investigating some Blade mysteries, if you will. So that's what we're going to talk about in our first podcast here. One of the things that has immediately struck me in this podcast is that I hate to listen to my own voice, and I used to think that I'd have a good voice for this type of thing, and I've listened to some other podcasts from Chris Hardwick on the Nerdist and Mark Marone, and I think, man, their voices aren't that great. And then you start to do one of these things, and you realize that their voice is so much better for radio than your own voice, and you become almost jealous. It seems like those guys do these things without even trying, and and then you get involved with something like this, and you're like, oh my goodness, what am I doing? But here we are. We're gonna go with it anyways. So, Katey, do you know much about Blade? Because Blade, so he gets his start in 1998. And you're probably... Are you even in diapers? Are you...
I'm a little older than diapers, but...
Yeah.
No, honestly, I don't know very much about Blade. I know a lot about the new and upcoming superheroes. I know a lot about, like, anime and things that are going on right now in that realm. But I have not heard about Blade until, like, an hour ago when you asked me to come on your podcast. So,
which is good.
Totally
this is good because I think honestly, to a lot of people, that's exactly what they know about Blade. They probably almost know nothing, and there's this weird divide, I think, in ages, and it's probably not even that big in some cases. And I think Blade was really big to people, particularly superhero fans, because for a long time he was like the only one we had that did good. There were some kind of Batman movies that were kind of, a couple of them were good, a couple of them were really bad. There were those old Christopher Reeve Superman movies, and there just was not a whole lot else. And out of nowhere comes Blade. Now, a lot of people didn't know Blade was actually a comic book movie. It was kind of a horror movie. It was kind of an action movie. It starred Wesley Snipes, who lots of people knew as Wesley Snipes, and probably went to see the movie because of Wesley Snipes. But it did really well, and it was one of the first movies to kind of be like this cool, edgy, awesome superhero movie that's not a cartoon. and it was kind of mind-blowing, and it did phenomenally well. And this brings me to one of my first kind of one things I want to talk about Blade, is that he's never done very well in the comics, but in the film universe, he was the first main Marvel person to get a movie. He had more movies, successful movies than Iron Man did. And I mean, now when you go back, like, that's hilarious. Blade 2 comes out, he has more movies than Captain America, and the previous Captain America movie was this lame movie in the 1990s, which would make your generation just laugh that anyone would watch that movie. There's lots of lame superhero movies that you guys would laugh at, but we watched them back then because that was all we had, and that's why I think that's why I think Blade is always going to have this special place in people's heart, who are from that era and kind of remember how lame things were, and then Blade just comes out of nowhere and kind of kicks things off.
Yeah, I can feel that. I mean, I haven't personally been affected by that, but I think that's a really special thing to have, like a first real superhero movie.
And some other things to even consider, I think, diversity in comics is a huge issue now, trying to get new black superhero characters on the screen, and not just black, but Asian and all kinds of different types of characters on screen. I always say my personal philosophy is that I think everyone deserves a hero, and so I'm all for that. But one of the interesting things about Blade is he didn't just have success, but he had all the success, and he was a black hero, which I think even makes it
more empowering.
Yeah, more empowering, more cool. It was even more of a cool thing. And he had a whole trilogy of movies based around him, and it's kind of funny. It's kind of funny to think about before Iron Man, before Captain America movies. As we're now approaching Captain America: Civil War. It's gonna be a massive movie, but before all that, Blade had 3 movies, and that's kind of funny. And it happened. It's real. And I think why was that? And I think the Blade movies were really smart. And it wasn't just Wesley Snipes. There's a few people, but they played on genres because I think people were afraid to make just a superhero movie. I don't think special effects had quite hit the point where you could do Spider-Man yet. Blade was before Spider-Man. Yeah. Blade was before X-Men. And it made people more comfortable to make it an action movie. And they were like, well, it's going to be an action horror movie. And it was never marketed as a comic book movie. And it's so funny because now comic book movies are all the rage, but back then that was a really risky thing. Yeah. And I think that's how it was made. But I think definitely all the geeky comic book kids latched onto that concept and were like, oh yes, this is kind of what we've been waiting for. And maybe I'd always wanted Spider-Man at that point. Spider-Man was my main hero, and obviously I was excited when Spider-Man 1 came out, but Blade did it for me. I really became a huge Blade fan after that.
And I think it's unique that they incorporate action and horror into it, because I think a lot of movies that came out of that time weren't really into that. Or, of course, they're not into, like, superheroes, but they're also not so into, like, horror or action. And so I think it was a safe yet unique approach to film during that time.
I agree. I mean, you had the action movies, which Wesley Snipes had been a part of many, but you didn't have many action horror combinations.
Yeah.
It was weird. And I think also there's a lot of interesting contrasts just within Blade himself. You don't normally associate African Americans and vampires. You think of vampires and you think of sort of like stodgy old guy,
or
very pale people.
Yeah.
You almost think of the antithesis of this black karate guy flinging stakes into vampire. You just don't think about that.
No, or you think of like a sappy love story like Twilight, or maybe like an empowering young woman like Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's true. And it's funny that Blade actually came. There was definitely like this peak. I'd say now we're like in the zombie stage. Like everybody's all about zombies, but we definitely before the zombie stage had the Twilight like vampire stage of monsterism.
I definitely went through that.
Yeah, and Blade kind of missed that boat. It's kind of funny. Like he could have rode that wave. You know, if he was just a little bit later, but he didn't. And also his vampires were never quite playing on this romantic vein that it was much more action packed horror orientation. But still, you think he could have maybe
rode it a little bit more.
Yeah, rode that wave a little bit. But they still did really well. Partially, I think, because Wesley Snipes is just a bad man, and you just know he's a bad man. Like you see how he moves, and it's like, oh yeah, that guy's actually legit. Like that guy, he could actually kick butt. You see some other actors, and it's kind of like debatable. And Wesley Snipes just has this aura about him, and he doesn't even need to go into his martial arts background, which he does have, and like explain all his credentials. You're just like, yeah, he can kick my butt, and he can probably kick these vampires' butts. And you almost start to feel bad for these vampires. It's like, oh man, these guys are just like out of their league. And when you get to the comic and how that all starts, it's interesting because he's the same way. And he just comes out of nowhere and he just takes over the whole show. Before we get into the comic, though, I think we should talk about a couple of the big things that I think we want to talk about in this podcast. I mentioned before some of the looming mysteries of Blade and what those entail. And so there's two. So first one is Wesley Snipes has been in jail recently for a couple years due to IRS tax evasion type of issues. I apologize, Wesley, if I messed that up, but something related to tax he got arrested for. He went to jail. He is now out of jail. Thank you. I'm happy to have him back with us, back to making movies and doing shows and stuff, because I like Wesley Snipes a lot, if you can't tell. So he's out of jail. He can now make more Blade movies. He can make Blade shows. And another big thing that happened is that Marvel reacquired the film rights for Blade. So it won't just be a Blade film. It will be a Blade film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. A Blade film with, Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man and Captain America and all the other guys, which I think makes it even more interesting. And there's more things you can do with that. And Marvel has so much stuff going on now. It's hard to keep track of. They have all the major movies. They have Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Most Wanted on ABC. They have these Netflix shows. And now they're even starting these kind of almost teenage girl-oriented films on, the Freeform. Do you watch Freeform?
A little bit.
Pretty Little Liars and...
Yes.
Yeah. So now Marvel's even going into that space. So they have lots of these different options, and it's hard to necessarily say what are they going to do with Blade, but everyone's wondering, Marvel, what are you guys going to do with Blade? And I'm not the only one. There's lots of bloggers blogging about this. I've actually been online, and there's actually about 3 or 4 guys who actually have a full screenplay written of what they think Blade 4, the film, will be. And different speculation. Will it retain, Wesley Snipes? Will it have a new actor? Is it going to carry on some of the characters of the Blade films, or will it be entirely separate? There's lots of weird questions, and no one has an exact answer. The other funny thing, though, happened is that this San Diego Comic-Con, the last one, so July of 2015, Marvel has this huge presentation releasing a new comic book of Blade, which made some noise, and it was going to have a female version of Blade. It was going to be Blade's daughter, Fallon Gray, and it made so much noise. But inexplicably, this comic disappeared, and Marvel just is like, yeah, we're not doing that anymore. And I think how they even shelved, they shelved it by saying it might still come out, or it's just been delayed. But I think now we're sitting at 6 months after when it was supposed to come out, and I've kind of followed the creators of the comic, and they're doing other things. They aren't even signed up to work for Marvel right now. So it's pretty clear that they shelved this thing. And the shelving was just bizarre because it received so much positive press at that Comic-Con and just on the web. It really just created this huge firestorm, this huge frenzy. And for them to just not go forward with it, it just seemed utterly bizarre. And there's lots of speculation as to why. And I think we should go into and kind of talk about it. And I've done my own sleuthing around. The way that I guess I do is I ask annoying questions to people on Twitter and see if they respond. I'm not like a cool reporter, but I have access to this big Twitter account, and I can ask annoying questions, and that's what I do. And I began with lots of annoying questions to Wesley Snipes, and Wesley Snipes never responded to me. I really kind of had this bizarre dream and thought that, oh yeah, Wesley Snipes is totally going to respond to me, but he never did. But I did have some luck with some other people, and I did get some kind of interesting answers, some kind of funny answers, and so we can kind of go into that. And I think the reason for that comic being taken down may actually have a lot to do with what Marvel's plans are with Blade as far as TV or film go. So we'll go into that mystery later. I think we need some spooky music or something. Do you have any spooky music?
I believe I do.
That's pretty spooky. That's pretty good.
Well, we're looking at something very suspicious.
Yeah. So suspicious Marvel activity going on here. So Blade's origin. I think everybody knows Blade, but how does he begin? It's pretty similar in both the comic and the movie. His mother is, I would say, heavily implied to be a prostitute living in London, and she's pregnant, and the doctor comes to help her as she's giving birth. The doctor is a vampire. Not good. That's not good. You never, when you have, this is something you realize when you have kids, is that you always think you're going to get the doctor you go see, like for all these appointments and things, and that's never the same doctor that actually ends up delivering your kid. So it's the same case of Blade's mom. I'm sure she went to some doctor down the street, Dr. Watson in London. He doesn't show up, He's on vacation on the big day. So in walks this mystery doctor. Of course, that doctor is none other than a vampire who bites her and strikes her down. And Blade is born still. And in this weird way, he acquires all the powers and strengths of a vampire, but not the weaknesses. So he can walk around in daylight and be like, what? But he can also throw someone through a wall. And, he has that kind of dichotomy of powers. He is, in that sense, entirely, unique to the vampire world. When he is first created as a comic, he really is meant to be just kind of this guest. He's kind of supposed to be in the background. He's created in Dracula 10, 1973. Writer Marv Wolfman and artist Gene Colan are credited with his character creation. And Wolfman, he said he wanted a black vampire hero, and Colan basically drew up that design. Much of that original design is actually still consistent with how Blade is portrayed now, with the leather jacket and the cool hair and everything. I think one of the things Marv Wolfman found is that Blade basically took over the comic. So he has his characters, he has the story. It's all kind of based off these Dracula, vampire, hunter-slayer relatives and whatnot. He introduces Blade. Blade takes care of the show. Nobody cares about these guys anymore. And so he doesn't know what to do with it, because he realizes it as he's even writing it up. He's like, man, this guy's just taking over. And for a while, Blade is really kept in the background. And eventually it almost becomes, though, a fairly Blade-oriented book. He kind of just takes over. And I think that's just how interesting of a character he is that he's able to take over what was a really popular comic in the day of Tomb and Dracula. And another cool thing that he brings about is that he's actually brings about an all-black vampire hunting team, which I think is actually kind of funny to think about happening in the 1970s. That you have this black character starts out in supporting cast, and eventually ends up about 20 issues later with an all-black team hunting down vampires. I mean,
so cool.
It's pretty bizarre, like to think about that, but that's what happened. I should note that, you know, as far as the history of black characters go, Blade was not the first. Black Panther preceded him. Falcon preceded him. I think, you know, they basically started to come out in the 1960s, and Blade doesn't come out till like 1973. I actually think Luke Cage even preceded him in 1972 by a year. And then I'd say a couple years after him, you get Storm and Misty Knight. You get a couple other major black female characters. So he's not the first, but I would argue and say he's probably one of the best. I just think there's a lot of interesting aspects and ways you can go with Blade, both in literary and obviously cinematic form, that, you know, he had a lot of legs. You know, it's one thing to create, you know, a character that is diverse. It's another thing to create a character that just, you know, knocks down walls and is interesting to everyone. And that's who he is. And I think when you get right down to what makes Blade interesting is I think of him as a disruptor. You hear about like technologies that disrupt things, and I think of Blade that way because he hits the vampire world, and they're used to being hunted by these pansy vampire hunters. You know, there's like the priest who carries the cross and is like waving it around, like don't hurt me. You know, these guys are all kind of scared of the vampires. You know, maybe they can get a stake in. And you do have kind of like one fighter guy. You have like Van Helsing and his kids, and they go at him. But generally, you know, like they're just like, you get the feeling that the vampire hunters are completely outmatched by the vampires. The vampires are the predator, or the vampires are the predators, and the vampire hunters are just kind of just doing their best to try to bring these things down, and they're out of their league. Blade shows up, and he just starts kicking vampire butt, and the vampire world is just like, what the heck is this guy? He's one of us, but he's not one of us. He's kicking our butts. He doesn't die in sunlight. This guy's totally freaking us out. We don't even know what to do with him. And at the same time, the vampire hunters aren't really sure about Blade because Blade's a vampire. So they're kind of like, they keep him at like an arm's length. Like, I'm not really sure about you, man, because you have fangs, and I'm used to putting stakes in things with fangs. And so it automatically makes him into kind of this loner. And I think it's just an interesting place for any character to be, is kind of to be both awesome and yet reviled, to be very capable and yet hated, and really kind of not liked by just about anyone. And that's kind of Blade, and that's just who he is, and I think that's a large part of his appeal. I think also, you know, the feelings of distrust in Blade is also a great theme of just vampires in general. You know, there's something about vampires that just naturally plays upon that emotion of just like, I don't trust you, man. Like, or if you do trust them, you're gonna regret it because you're gonna end up as lunch. Yeah. Like, that pretty lady in the bar, like, oh yeah, she's hot, yeah. Oh, she likes me. She's flirting with me. She just bought me a drink. And all of a sudden, like, oh, she was a vampire. Oh man.
Now you're dead on the street.
Now you're dead. Now that's it. That's all she wrote. And I think everyone battles with the feelings of distrust, and certainly, like, he just fits so well into that because as a vampire hunter himself, he's out to try to kill vampires, but human beings don't trust him because he's a vampire. And what an awkward thing that is. Now, have you seen any of the Blade movies? Have you seen Blade 1?
I haven't seen any of them. They sound pretty interesting, though. After this, I'm about to go
now,
see on Netflix if there's any on there.
you told me that you like horror movies.
Oh yes, I love horror.
So yeah, I think you would like Blade, and like I said, I think he's interesting just in a lot of different lenses. I mean, in some sense, he's the ultimate vampire killing machine, being vampire self.
Yeah.
So I think where I'm getting at is, I'm in these comic stores, and I've just had, gotten these great conversation with Blade, and in particular with a lot of some Black geek friends I have. They've told me that they were drawn to Blade due to his cultural bipolarism, and I was kind of like, man, what does that even mean? But it's basically, it's a person that's between two worlds, and I've had these people say, like, I'm into geek culture, but geek culture is considered white culture, but I'm Black, and Black people may not like me because I'm into what they perceive as a white culture, while as white people may keep me as arm's length because I'm Black. So I feel like I'm in between worlds. And of course, that's exactly where Blade is. And I found this great quote that kind of just highlighted that, and it's from Ron Wimberly, who is a Marvel artist, and he's worked on things like Mighty Avengers and Superior Foes to Spider-Man. And he's interviewed at Marvel by why his favorite character is Blade. And he just offers this fantastic quote up, and I just had to share it. Blade paved the way for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Blade ushered in a new age of superhero cinema. Without Blade, there'd be no Guardians of the Galaxy. The idea of Blade speaks to my own personal experience. Blade has to deal with family dysfunction, the curbing of his own power privilege, while suffering from prejudice from others with privilege. His own internalized racism, self-loathing. Blade deals with cultural bipolarism. Blade has to deal with the economic and temporal class rifts. And I was like, think about that quote. I mean, that quote packs a lot of punches. It's kind of like, wow, let's think about all the things and all the different ways that this character speaks to someone. That's not just like asking some celebrity and he offers up some lame answer. That's like it's a well thought out answer. It's like one of those answers. It's like, man, I could just write a whole novel, and like that could be like a chapter by chapter index. So, and I think you could begin to just ponder that temporal class rifts, cultural bipolarism, privilege, internalized racism, self-loathing, and how Blade speaks to all those things. And I think that's when you're dealing with a really powerful character, a character that has legs that can touch upon lots of different things like that, and hit someone on all these powerful internal chords. And I think with that quote, I'm just going to leave it right there for now. We'll try to get back and figure up do the rest of our Blade podcast. And hopefully Katey Komics comes back with me and does this. Are you down?
I will.
Yeah. Are you going to see Blade before the next one?
Yes, I will.
Yes. that could be good. I'm just going to throw that out there that you might want to do that. Maybe you could talk about Blade and cosplay.
For sure.
Because you know some stuff about that for sure. All right. So everyone, I hope you like this podcast. I hope you found it interesting, and we are going to leave you with some music by Alon Vital. I'm also going to try to have those guys on a cast. They're getting ready to release their second album, and I'm really pumped for that. And those guys are hilarious. I'd say every single member of that band could probably do a podcast better than me. So I think whatever we do there will be great and awesome, and you should tune into. All right. Until next time.